roll up, roll up. Do we have a show for you? The ultimate boring showdown between the top 3 operating systems on the planet. On the left, we have Mac, the big name in graphic arts. In the center, we have Linux in everything from mobile phones to submarines, from modems to monster computers. And on the right, we have the big name in PCs, Microsoft. Let's see how they go. Okay, to give a bit of a feel about how things operate with the 3 systems, let's begin by starting them up. Now, both the Windows and Linux installation will need me to intervene a little bit, and the Apple too, I guess, to some extent. But both the Windows and Linux installations have options of different bootloading processes, whereas Apple basically just boots the one thing. Alright, so without spending any more time, let's just start up the Apple. Linux, Windows. So I guess there's about a second between them. Okay, I'll respond to each thing as quickly as I can. Oh, it's up and running already. That's pretty quick. These machines, I've deliberately made them quite similar hardware. They've all got 2 GB of RAM. The Windows machine unfortunately has got a significantly faster CPU. I couldn't help that with the hardware I've got. And Apple's got the slowest CPU, and the Linux is actually in the middle. We've got 2 GHz, 3.25 GHz and 2.8 GHz. So there's a fair spread of CPU speed, but every other specification is pretty much identical. Same amount of RAM, similar hard drives, similar monitor resolution, so they're all doing about the same work. In any case, it should be similar enough so we can do a fair comparison of how they work. I think all 3 of them actually look quite beautiful to my eye, quite pleasant. The Apple, actually to me seems the plainest of all things, but that's all taste. The system monitor is running. I'll get the system monitor running on this guy. And well, they're called something different, all 3 systems. Okay, I'll give them a similar job to do. At the moment, the Windows installation is, they're all sort of doing about 2-3%. Very low CPU usage at the moment. Hang on. RAM. The RAM's sitting about just shy of a gigabyte on the Windows installation. 570 odd megabytes on Linux. And what do we got here? CPU memory. About 720. Okay, we'll give them all a job to do. I want them running as similar software as I can get. Okay. Just wait for YouTube to load on all of them. As you can see, they seem to perform fairly similarly. But what has changed is the Windows system is running at a bit over a gigabyte of RAM. I'll just start a Terminal. Windows is already using about 268 megabytes of swap space. Linux is using none, and Apple is also using none. I'll just verify that I'm not talking nonsense. Okay, yeah, it's using no swap space at the moment. Okay. So what you can see there is a difference of how they're allocating resources already. Even though they're not doing much, Windows is already using swap space, which means it's already starting to wear the hard drive. And if you've got an SSD, it's starting to wear the SSD. So obviously you'd need to have a lot of RAM in any of the machines to be able to afford a heavy load on them. But all three machines have got swap space enabled, but neither the Linux or the Mac system are using swap space with this load, but Windows is. So Windows is already detrimental to your hard drive. SSDs don't like being written to, and also platinum drives don't really like being written to either. So Windows is already starting to shorten the life of the computer, just like that. The other thing with the swap space on Windows, the swap space is written on the NTFS file system, which creates fragmentation on the drive. On the Linux installation, it's actually a separate partition. That separate partition is very, very simple for the operating system to move information in and out of the RAM to the hard drive. On Apple, it is also a file similar to the swap file that's on Windows. But the file system on there, I believe, is HFS. They haven't moved past that. And I believe Microsoft's still using NTFS. Linux has got multiple different kinds of file systems. I've arbitrarily installed ext4 and BTRFS. That segregation of the partitions is a big asset to Linux, which it actually makes it probably the superior for high workload, just straight off the bat. And you can already see evidence of that. It's using the least amount of RAM, and it's not using any swap space at all. If we give it some more to do, what have we got here? Let's do an Office package, there we go. That's a fairly heavy package. I don't have any Office packages installed on Microsoft. But we're still only coming up to 750 megabytes used. So it's still very light on RAM, even with an Office package running, as well as the YouTube page. It's still running lighter by quite a bit than the Microsoft installation. And it's lighter than the Mac. The Mac's running the web browser, the terminal, and the system monitor. If we run a terminal on the Linux installation, we'll see the same thing. I don't think it'll change the RAM at all. Well, nothing perceivable. Okay, so Linux is using the least RAM, even though it's doing the most work by quite a bit. That's a first hint as to the long-term durability of the system. But in any case, I created quite a, I'll show you what I'm reading, quite a long list of choices. I'll put that up more clearly on the video later on. And I've made categories of merit for all of the three systems. I'll just read them in a short format. The first thing is likability. Second is hardware. Thirdly, peripheral hardware. Ease of use, the software range, security, performance, cost, and I guess probably the biggest thing for me, funny enough, personally, is the philosophy. Okay, so let's just go into those details. The likability. I guess one of the first things you encounter when you have a new computer is what's it like straight out of the box. With Apple, you take it out of the box, put it on the table, start it up, and that's pretty much good to go, barring a few personal settings and maybe your specific software installation of what you're going to be using from day to day. All right, Linux. The software installation is usually separated from the hardware, so it doesn't really have an out-of-the-box factor. A few vendors are selling hardware with Linux installed, but it's more of a rarity. More likely outcome is you're going to have hardware that you put Linux on. So out of the box, it's the least performing in that regard. Windows, you can get some pre-installed Windows systems, again basic configuration. I found the Mac was actually quite quick to get off the ground, so was Windows installation, and so was the Linux installation. But straight out of the box, Mac's the winner. I've given it a score of 10 out of 10, Linux 8, Microsoft 9. Consistency. Now, the consistency in this context is once it's up and running, how consistent is the behaviour across the different applications on the desktop. Now, Apple's in front again there. They have quite a neat formula of how all the desktop items work. Linux is based on open source software, and there's a lot of variety of libraries and so forth, and historically different bundles of software have started from a different origin, so you end up with different libraries, although most of the distributions have a sort of a reconciliation of the different behaviours to a reasonable state. Ubuntu is pretty good at it. Microsoft also suffers from inconsistency because, again, different software has a different history, different libraries in the background. So Apple's a winner on that one. But once up and running, as you can see, they're quite pleasant looking systems, all three, and they drive in a very similar manner. Linux has got a lot more customizable features, so the consistency is, again, a bit determined by the user, how the user decides to set it up. But in any case, I've given Apple 9 for consistency, Linux 8, Microsoft 9. Now, being configurable, to me, makes a lot of sense, a lot of advantage. Now, Apple is pretty much not configurable. It's not quite true, but it's difficult to get too far from where it starts. Linux is completely configurable. You can even create your own distribution with its own preferences. I mean, it could be running the engine on a car, it could be running a mobile phone, desktop, server, monster computer, whatever. And Microsoft sort of somewhere in between the two. You've got the vendors' behaviour, but basically you've got what they have made, plus minus some personalisation. Okay, so I've given Apple 5, Linux 10, and Microsoft 8 for configurable changes. Is it plain fun? Well, Apple is actually quite, although beautiful, it's quite plain. Linux is fun in the way you can do all sorts of whiz-bang gizmos and animations and all sorts of things. I tend to opt for something fairly plain myself, but you can make it as fun as you like. You can have desktop cube, wobbly windows, all sorts of things. You could look on YouTube and find other demonstrations of that. And Windows, there's a little bit of configuration you can do, but it's not quite as much fun. So really, on the fun side of things, I've still given them an equal score of 9 across the board, but it's subject a lot to a personal opinion. The interface interference by the system is another thing that changes your likability. If the system pops up with updates and sort of hijacks your machine, or a virus scan holds your machine to a grinding slow pace, or those sorts of things where the system's interfering with your process, that really drops the likability factor quite a lot. I found the update on the Mac irritating when it was asking me for the login for iTunes. Linux simply notifies you that there's updates available. It's up to you whether you install them or not. You've only got to type your system password, which is your login password anyway. And on Windows was the most annoying because let's say you want to shut down your machine. If it's got to do updates, it'll hijack your machine so you can't even shut it down, which is a real pain if you've got laptops and things like that. where you want to get out the door and you've got to wait 10 minutes for it to do its updates. Okay, so that interference factor, I gave Apple a score of 6, Linux a score of 9, Microsoft score of 3. Now hardware, support for new hardware. Well, Apple is only ever new hardware when you get it, but it is a very, very small range, so that's hampered the way I could sort of grade it. The other two have got a very, very large range and potential for new hardware on the fly. Although with Microsoft, if you were to change the motherboard, you'd start having grief because the hardware abstraction layer is quite difficult. On Linux, depending on how the system's been set up, you can even have it such a way that you can swap a hard drive from one machine to another, and it'll pretty much find its way around the hardware and just boot up and run properly anyway. It'll auto-detect most things. What I say about setup, because there is a configuration which works with hardware identifiers, and you'd have to set it up for /dev, which can be done. It takes probably about 10 minutes to do the swap over, and then you can basically make your hard drive portable machine to machine. Okay, keeping on going with that hardware. Support for old hardware. Well, Linux is absolutely out in front on that. I've got a printer which at the time was not edge-to-edge printing. It's a photo printer. I would have had to spend a significant amount of more money for this photo printer to be edge-to-edge from Epson. Of course, now it's an old machine. Neither Windows nor Epson support that printer, so it's basically abandoned. The open source drivers on Linux, there's probably about 2 dozen that'll actually drive that printer. But what's really cute is now it gives me edge-to-edge printing. To replace that printer would cost me about $3,000. So it saved me $3,000 to have open source software allowing me to use a printer in a way that I never could from Epson's drivers or from Microsoft for that matter. I'm not sure about Apple supporting that printer, but I'd imagine it would also be abandoned by Apple because they usually don't supply the drivers for their printers, etc. Okay, so Mac, or Apple, 5 out of 10, Linux 10 out of 10, and Microsoft 8 out of 10. I found that legacy drivers are a little bit more available on Microsoft from third parties. Okay, I've already mentioned changing the hardware. If you have to change hardware on the fly, Apple's the least tolerant, Linux is the most tolerant, and Windows is between the two. Be pretty good at auto-detecting the peripherals and auto-installation. Although the two proprietary ones are better at the new stuff, but again they rely on the hardware vendors to provide the drivers, etc. Linux is more suitable for, I'd say, hardware roughly 4 months old or older for auto detection and installing. But whatever is set up on Linux as a driver actually auto configures a lot better than the other two. So it's very, very hard to pick one out of the other. So I separated that old from new in the category there. And where am I? They all three scored 26 out of 30 for that. Quite cute. Okay. Next category is software range. Now, from the vendors, the two commercial ones actually don't supply that much software. Of course, the Linux distributions supply pretty much all the software you need. Ubuntu here is like 50 to 60,000 packages. Third-party vendors, of course, Microsoft being the most common PC operating system, they've got the biggest following of vendors. And of course, when it comes to open source, it comes back to Linux again has that advantage that it's built on open source, but not only is open source available, but it's also managed by the distribution you're using. Whereas the open source is available for Mac and Windows, but you've really got to do a lot to bring anything together. For argument's sake, if you were to install a package like GIMP on on Linux, you tick boxes and you get all sorts of other advanced tools, like animation packages, lens correction, all that sort of stuff. On Windows, you actually have to go to different sites and find all the bits and bobs together to make it happen. And that actually can be quite daunting and quite tedious and slow. On Linux, it's tick another box and it installs it for you. So using open source software is very, very easy. Then, of course, there's free software, which is not to be confused with open source, because open source is in fact quite secure and safe and sturdy and well tested. Whereas free software can be written by anyone, they just put it up on the internet somewhere, and it could be full of malicious code. So free software I would really not recommend for any of the systems, but probably the most durable against the free software would be Linux. So when it comes to software, out of a score of 40, because of the free software problems and also the availability of open source software, I've actually scored quite heavily against Apple. 17 out of 40, Linux 34 out of 40, and Windows at 26 out of 40. That's a bit of a hard one to judge. You might come up with a different scale, but I think that would basically come back to your priorities. But feel free to disagree with those there. Now, security. Well, the most vulnerable to viruses, far and away, is Microsoft. Well known for two reasons. One, its own system is relatively promiscuous, and it needs like firewall software and antivirus software and so forth installed to protect it. Although Microsoft has done a fair job on Windows 10 to protect it, but it actually needs protective software. Whereas the other two are based on a Unix style system, and ports have to be open to make a connection, not closed to protect. It's a very different, it's the opposite way of doing security. Also, just simply because the population of Microsoft, if you're going to write a malicious code of any sort, it's a better target. You get more bang for your effort, sort of thing. So Microsoft's a bigger target, plus it's a softer system. So of course that's going to be attacked most by viruses. I'd like to say there is no viruses available for Linux. Apparently there are a couple. My understanding is you have to download and install them pretty much, and then also give them permission to do damage. So it's almost an installable piece of software, the way I understand it to be. I've scanned for viruses on the Linux systems roughly once a year. I haven't found anything, so there you have it. And Apple is something similar to Linux as far as that's concerned. Viruses. Now the malware, things like Trojans, keyloggers, that kind of guff. If you open an email with Linux that's got malware on it, chances are it's for Microsoft, so it's a fundamental advantage anyway. If you were to download and install on Linux, if you install it as an unprivileged user, it's only got permission to do the damage to your files, not to the system. So it's relatively robust against those sorts of attacks, whereas Microsoft's relatively vulnerable. Yeah. And of course the malicious attacks by humans, well, they're all, anything's possible to be attacked by a human. But when you consider the likes of Facebook, YouTube, your bank servers or whatever, they're usually running Linux anyway. So there's a lot of effort spent on making that as tough as possible. Accidental destruction by users. Now, it's a good area of security. On Linux, you log in as your regular user, you can't really delete system files because you don't have access to them. If you log on as administrator, you can do some damage. I described the partitions earlier, where you have a partition set aside for, say, the home folder for all the users, the way I've set it up here, and one for the operating system. So if the user goes and fills up the drive full of data or photos, videos, whatever, it won't cripple the system if it's set up like that. On Microsoft, most programs, the system and whatnot, tend to steer all the file saving and access and software installation pardon me, onto drive C. Even if you have drive D set up on it, you have to consciously make sure you're saving the files onto drive D. Okay, so now we're on to performance. Well, you saw the speed of startup, so I don't really have to talk about that too much. Okay, one thing that affects performance quite a bit is how it handles resources. We already saw the swap space difference. What's interesting, the Mac here is switched into starting to compress RAM. It uses a system for compressing RAM to obviously spare the access to the swap space. I'll just see whether we're using swap space now. So just sitting around, it's been, no, still no swap space. Somehow or other RAM's been filling. I suspect YouTube videos and things like that have been steadily filling RAM here and there. Okay, so what I was coming to there, by using swap space kind of prematurely or very, very frequently, creates wear and tear on SSD, creates wear on the hard drive, but by doing that also is slowing down the system. So the performance is affected dramatically when you think that RAM operates probably 10 to 100 times faster than the hard drive. So any involvement of the hard drive is a big performance trimmer. The absolute maximum throughput is again affected by how much resources are left to doing the job you're wanting to do rather than running the system. And Linux is definitely far and away the lightest. Still running it very much lighter, so we're seeing it over a good period of time. We've got about 1.3 gigabytes on the two commercial systems, and we're still running at around 800 megabytes on the Linux installation there, and it's running both an Office package plus the YouTube. So I find that very cute that it's doing sort of, I'm going to say twice the work, it's probably not fair, but it's doing a lot more work and it's using less resources. So the total throughput is definitely, going to be affected by that. The thing that affects performance is if you can automate functions, so it'll do a lot of work for you. Now Linux is the most open-ended as far as automation. Seriously, so free for you to design things to suit yourself. Of course that requires a bit of knowledge, but you can do it. Okay, so out of a score of 60, performance-wise, I've given Apple 42, Linux 54, Microsoft 44. Next thing is cost. Cost's a bit of a mixed bag because the total cost of ownership of something is not only how much it costs to buy, but also how much it costs to maintain, and also what it might cost for you to implement. And what I mean by that is perhaps training and time wasted on getting things rolling. Alright, now what I found for me personally, what drove me into using open source software, is I'd installed Windows XP on a computer from my factory. You can see I'm in a factory, so this all relates back to my own business. I'd installed Windows XP on a machine. I'd spent a day and a half installing Office packages and CAD programs and all the bits and pieces you need, for a business to function. And after the day and a half, the system just died on me. So I decided at that point, this is must have been about a dozen years ago, I decided at that point Microsoft's having nothing more to do with my own business because of that one incident. And I spent about 3 to 6 months finding all the software together to run on open source that would do the same job. I didn't quite succeed. I ended up having to buy a CAD package. But that was quite an acceptable thing for me. In any case, here we are now. I'm doing this demonstration in the hope that it may be of use to people. And there we go. The cost of installing Linux is, well, you can use older hardware. I tend to use like new hard drives and all the rest second-hand. So the premium's taken off it. But it does take some knowledge and it does take a little bit of time to get going. So it's not without cost either. Apple, you buy the machine, put it on the floor like I said earlier, turn it on, personalise settings, install your software. It's probably the quickest off the mark but most expensive to buy. roughly for this given amount of performance, you're spending twice the money. Roughly, depending on what the hardware is. And Windows is somewhere between the two. Now, both the commercial systems, of course, you're buying software left, right and centre, and you tend to be railroaded into an upgrade cycle. Whereas on Linux, the system upgrades, but unless the hardware fails, you don't really have to do anything about it. I've got a laptop that's a 2001 model. I'm still actually using it. It's getting a little slow now, but it's actually still doing every job I need it to do, which is kind of cute. And another part of the cost is how much software do you actually need to buy to make the system useful for you? Well, in my own case, in my own business, I only had to buy one CAD package, and the rest was free software. So the other two, of course, you pretty much have to buy everything you're going to do. Right, out of a score of 30 as far as cost, low being undesirable, higher number being most desirable as far as cost, Apple 13 out of 30, Linux 27 out of 30, Microsoft 20 out of 30. Again, I guess that's what your priorities are as to how you'd interpret those costs, but that's how it worked out for me. But again, I guess I have done the learning. Other people would have to spend some time learning how to use like a Linux system, so the cost may be higher for them, so that might change those numbers. Alright, there is a fundamental thing about the philosophy behind the system, which the two commercial systems are there to make money for the vendor. That's why they exist. They put out a system for you within the, whatever their design constraints happen to be, what they decide's a priority, in the aim of making a marketable product that you will be buying to make them a profit. Open source software is right around the other way. People are giving, I'm going to say freely of their time. It's not quite true because they do actually earn money from it, but in a different route. And they basically are intending to make software run as good as they can at that moment and make it open to everyone else in the open source community. It takes a bit of understanding the philosophy, but basically everyone is contributing to a combined resource that everyone can use. So it is actually, in a sense, self-serving to be giving out an open source world. But it's done the opposite way around. By feeding each other, we all eat, rather than feeding ourselves, we eat. So it's philosophy behind the system that fundamentally puts open source ahead for me. Okay, we're at the business end. The total scores out of 330. Mac 216, Linux 282, Microsoft 234. That was actually a lot closer than I thought it would be, funny enough. I've cut the whole thing down to a summary of what I think the merits are, and of course, what my opinion is not necessarily what your opinion is going to be. That's fine. But the merits that I see with the Mac is it works great out of the box. It's clean, secure, but expensive and restrictive. Microsoft, large vendor support for software as well as hardware. That's reasonably configurable. A Linux, the largest hardware support, and that's mostly coming from legacy hardware and the fact that there's a very wide range of CPUs, etc., that is supported by it. It's the most configurable. It's secure. It's open-ended, both software and hardware. It can be tricky with the latest hardware, though. That's basically its biggest disadvantage. But yeah, that's it. I hope that little showdown was of interest to you. Bye.